and thank you, Corporal, for coming here. My data rank goes back to 28 January 1950, though. So I got you by a few months.
I'd say so.
Anyway, it's a thrill to be here and see a little wet weather out there. My gosh, it's amazing. I want to introduce my wife, Ann. Ann, stand up.
Hi, Ann.
She's the one that directs my life. I mean, you know, there's no question about that. I want to give you just a little background on growing up. My mother was a spiritualist minister. She was a disciple of Amy McPherson, who had a big program here in Los Angeles. She had her own church in National City, and the average congregation was about 315, so she was pretty popular. She was one of these spiritualists that would find things that people lost. It was just amazing. Anyway, my father, completely different. He, on his birth certificate, it says he was born somewhere in Sonora County, Texas, in a Conestoga in 1897.
Oh, wow.
He grew up in Tombstone, Arizona. He wore 6 guns on his hips from age 14 to 18. He was pretty wild. He and his buddy came out of a saloon one night. They didn't want to walk home, and they tried to steal a horse, but they both couldn't get on, and the sheriff caught them, threw them in a hoosgow, and when they sobered up, the sheriff gave them 2 options. 1, go to Leavenworth and hang, since it was a hanging offense, or 2, join the U.S. Army. Well, of course, naturally, he joined the Army, but I figured, I have 9 grandchildren, excuse me, and I figured they needed to know that their great-grandfather was a horse thief. In any event, he went on. He was a brakeman in 1914 with Barney Oldsfield, and he was involved in that one of the national races from Los Angeles to Phoenix called what the heck was it? Dust or something. I had it in my notes here. Cactus. It was a cactus dust. That's what it was. And anyway, he rode with Barney and had a good time. He later, in the Army, he was in the famous Rainbow Division. One of the people in his company was none other than Sergeant Alvin York, the first Medal of Honor winner there. He wound up flying, eventually got into the Army Air Wing, I guess if you could call it that, in a Curtiss Hayrack pusher. And that was a biplane with a gunner down below and a pilot up here with a rear engine. And they would fly down the German lines about 70 feet off the lines and shoot Germans and drop hand grenades on them. It was kind of an interesting experience. He would never talk about it, but I found out a lot about him. As John mentioned, I've been involved in 3 main wars. It seems like it was a long time ago, 68 years. I stepped ashore on the second wave of the Incheon landing as a young Marine with absolutely 0 training, combat type training. What happened was Coronado, which most of you know is about 130 miles south of here, it was a Navy town. In my graduating class of 1950, Coronado High School set a Guinness's record because 15 of the students, there were only 32 boys in my class, 15 of them went to the Naval Academy. And that was pretty significant. That represented, you know, responsibility and leadership and everything else. I couldn't get in. My father was a heavy-duty mechanic. One of my buddies that I played football with came down one day and he said, "Hey, Dean," he said, "I'm going to the academy in 2 weeks. Would you be willing to come down and cut my dad's grass and wash his car?" Well, yeah, sure I would. That's money. Well, I met his dad about a week later, and he was a retired brigadier general from the Marine Corps. And he said, "Son, what are you going to do when you graduate?" And I said, "I don't know." I said, "I couldn't get in the academy." And he says, "Well, yes, you can." He said, "There's a Marine Corps Reserve unit in San Diego, the 11th Tank Battalion," and he says, "All you got to do is put in 1 year of weekend warrior, then apply for Bainbridge Prep in Maryland, which had a 92% shoe-in." Well, needless to say, the next day I filled out all the paperwork. My parents signed for me because I was underage, and I went over to my first meeting, and they said, "Son, we're moving here in San Diego, so don't worry about coming to a meeting. We'll train you at Camp Pendleton in the summer." Well, needless to say, I forgot all about the Marine Corps. I had a football scholarship to the University of California. I went up there when I graduated. and I was there about 7 days, and I got a very nice telegram from our good President Truman, offering me a 17-day world cruise to Yokohama. And down on the bottom of the telegram, it said you have 24 hours to report to active duty. In any event, I raced home, and of course, we spent 6 days. Well, first of all, the Navy drugged one of these World War II victory ships out of mothballs over National City to North Island, and we loaded that thing for 6 days, and it was supposed to put 3,000 Marines on there, but we wound up with 4,300 on there. And it was when we were told to fall in and go on board one night, it was kind of like World War II when Johnny Comes Marching Home. There were 2 or 3 bands there, and there was ticker tape and everything. And I remember I had a gangplank there, and I walked over the gang. Of course, I didn't have a uniform at this point, and there was a bunch of us that didn't have uniforms. But there were 2 Marines in front of me, and just before I stepped on the gangplank, my mother came running over and handed me a box of See's candy. Now, you know, Marines don't eat candy in those days. That's pokey bait, and I was so embarrassed, I didn't know what to do. I thought, well, I'll just go up the gangplank, go across the ship, chuck it in the water, and write her a nice note. Well, I didn't get a chance to do that. I got up to the top of the gangplank, and I wound up 7 stories down in the bowels of this ship, which was just awful. In any event, they got us up every morning at 4:30. There was only 1 mess hall for the enlisted guys, and it took an hour and a half to get through it. And when you got there, all they had were green eggs and green potatoes. And the stench in there, the barf on the floor was almost 2 inches deep. You had to hang on to the serving line because you had to go over that way when the ship rolled, flash up and come back. Nobody could eat. It was just terrible. And about that, well, first of all, I only spent 1 night down in this hold. They gave us a piece of canvas with some manila rope, and we're supposed to put it around these rings. If the guy above you got in his bed, you couldn't get in. And the first night out, the guy up on top, 7 up, threw up, and that all came down through the rope. So I went up to top and found a stanchion and tied myself to it, and that's where I slept for 17 days. About the 3rd day out, though, I was getting kind of hungry because I didn't want to go back to this mess hall, and I remembered this box of candy. So I thought, well, I'll sneak down there when nobody's looking, and I'll just have a little bite of candy. Well, I found my rucksack, and sure enough, there was this box of candy, and I thought, gosh, Mom, what did you put in there? I thought it must be heavy fudge. Well, this was my first significant emotional event. I opened up that box, and inside was a brand new Colt 45 automatic. And I couldn't believe it because my mom, you know, was totally against guns. But that weapon saved my life a number of times in Korea, so it turned out to be a pretty good deal. We arrived in Korea. When we got to Yokohama, they marched us up to, those of us that didn't have uniforms, they marched us up to an Army BX and put us in pinks and greens, Army Class A uniform, and said where we were going. It was cold. Well, you know, and if you had any rank, you could pencil it on. I didn't have any rank. I was a private, no class. Then they marched us down to a warehouse, and because I was a pretty good sized kid, they gave me a Browning automatic rifle. Everybody else got M1s. Well, boy, I was thrilled. My gosh, that thing had a clip on it with 20 rounds in it. It was fully automatic or semi-automatic. It was just outstanding. They told me they'd teach me how to field strip it and shoot it between there and Incheon. The one thing they didn't tell me, though, those rats. Once you touch the trigger in combat, the life expectancy was 7 seconds. So it didn't take me too long to get rid of that BAR. But the Incheon landing was kind of quiet. It was most of the North Koreans were already going south down to the peninsula because that's where they're trying to kill all the Americans. And MacArthur really did, he was a genius in his exploits of that landing. He split our battalion because there was nobody really there in Incheon. Half of it went 14 miles north to a secure Kimpo airfield so he could get supplies in there. And the half that I was in went to K3, which is about 25 miles away. And that was my first experience really of combat. And it wasn't hand-to-hand or anything like that. We were marching along and we got caught in a North Korean mortar attack. And there was a bunker about 20 yards off this little path we were on. I think I did the half a mile run in 2 seconds. I was the first one in and the first one out. And the guys couldn't believe me that I went outside. The problem was, when I went in, I hit nothing but spider webs. And I was more afraid of the spiders than I was of the North Koreans. In any event, we're halfway inland, and every night when we bivouacked, usually there would be an OSS officer, Office of Strategic Service, the predecessor to the CIA, would come in and he'd want to talk to our commander, who was usually a second lieutenant. And this major came in this one evening and he said he needed 14 volunteers for a classified mission. Well, this is where the brotherhood of the Marine Corps is just above and beyond everything else. The entire company stood up. And that just rattled through your body, and you were so proud to be a Marine you couldn't believe it. In any event, we went up 18 miles behind the enemy lines. We blew up this resupply depot. On the way home, we were traversing the side of a hill, and the North Koreans hit us with mortars. Well, they killed, a mortar round went off in front of me, killed the 2 Marines in front of me, and killed the one behind me and blew me over this cliff. And then they killed everyone, but they didn't find me. I was down about maybe 35 yards in the brush down there, and I was out cold at the time. When I woke up, I could hear the North Koreans above me. They were desecrating the bodies and taking the ammo and all that sort of stuff. So I just lay there, and actually I slept. And the next morning I woke up, they were still up there, so I lay there for 12 hours until it got dark. Then I worked my way out of there and came back to our lines, which weren't very far away. And of course, we had a classified code to get through. And again, I learned that Marines have a tendency to shoot first and ask questions later. But I got through. But the point was, my mother got her first telegram, that horrible telegram that the government sends out, we regret to inform you that your son was killed in action. Well, she didn't believe it. In any event, I wound up at a little mountain village called Hagaru-ri. It's about 14 miles below not the Incheon, but the Chosin Reservoir. And I was going to be a replacement rifleman for some of the Marines up on the 7th, but there was only 12 of us, and the shirt wanted us to wait until we got 20. Well, about November 26th, the Chinese entered the war, and everything went to hell in a hurry. There was about somewhere between 72 and 8,000 Marines in this little mountain village. And I'd heard of Colonel Hallie Mad Smith, but I'd never met him. But he was on a box with a megaphone going around in circles, excuse my language now. He was saying, Marines, 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 USOBs, gotta be happy. You are surrounded by 120,000 Chinese soldiers. You guys can shoot in any direction. And that brought the house down. Needless to say, it was a tough road out of there. It was 75 miles down to Hang Nam. I was one of the last 3 Marines out of Hagaru-ri. And when I arrived at Kodo-ri, which is about 9 miles down the road, first of all, the Chinese press said that they were going to completely annihilate the 1st Marine Division, 5th Marines and 7th Marines. And in 10 days. Well, in 10 days went by, we lost 1,500 Marines. The Chinese lost 60,000. So that tells you something about Marines. In any event, I arrived at this mountain village, Kodo-ri. It was another small, Hagaru had a small runway on it, and so did Kodo-ri. And they had 4 Goonie birds there that were hauling wounded and deceased Marines out of there. When I arrived, there was a tech sergeant up there, and he said, he yelled at me, and he said, who was I? And I told him I was Private Hunter. He said, you're now a corporal. He says, get your 2 Marines and come up here. He says, I want you to take this gunny, or this half-track vehicle, and put it on one side of this runway because the Chinese have the other end of the runway secured. And there was a 50 caliber machine gun on there. So we did this, and he said, be sure and pull it over far enough so it won't hit the wings of the Goonie birds as they're taking off. Well, one of the aircraft commanders, who was a young lieutenant, jumped out of his aircraft, and there was a Corsair sitting up there about, maybe 45 yards away. he yelled at me to follow him. Well, this guy had to be a track star. I couldn't believe it. Thank God. He got in the aircraft up there, the Corsair, and there's 650 caliber machine guns in it. Thank God I arrived at the back end of the aircraft, because all of a sudden all 650s went off. And he said, get your other Marines, we're gonna move this thing down and put it on the other side of the runway, which we did. Then we put a 50-gallon drum of gas under the tail so the guns would go down and not up. Well, one of the Goney birds, these are DC-3s now, took off without waiting, and of course the Chinese shot him down, and it crashed on the end of the runway, killed everyone. The other 3 waited. Well, the last thing this young lieutenant did, the other 2 Goney birds took off, and he came back to the back of the aircraft, and he said, get your 2 guys and come over here and get on board. And I looked at him and I said, no, sir. I said, if we get on board, you won't get out of here. And I'd never seen an officer cry. And he stood there. Pardon me, I get emotional once in a while. He cried and he said, look, he said, you got to get on here. I said, we won't. I said, get out of here now or you won't get out at all. So he took off, and of course he made it out and he wagged his wings, and we got out of there as soon as we could with this half-track. It was an exciting ride, I mean, with bullets bouncing off of it and everything, but we ran out of gas about 3-4 miles from Hang Nam, and we hoofed it from there. When we got to the harbor out there, the civil engineers, these were the predestined SEAL program, were blowing up the harbor, and there was a little 17-foot ship-to-shore boat out there with a CB in it, and he was running around in circles, and I fired a clip of 20 rounds over his head with my bar, and he came running over. He said, are you Marines? And we said, yes. He said, jump. Well, it was 8 feet down to the water, and it was somewhere between 30 and 50 degrees below zero. It was kind of exciting, but we got into this little boat, and he picked up the other civil engineers, and as he started out, he said, where did you guys come from? And we told him. He said, I said, well, what's the date today? Because I'd forgotten completely. He said, well, you don't know what today's date is? And I said, no. He said, well, it's Christmas Eve. Well, what he said we're going to do, that was kind of an emotional event for all of us in the boat. He said, we're going to go down the coast, and he said, when we run out of gas, we'll come into the coast, and then we'll hoof it from there going south. Well, we ran into an LCI, which is a larger landing ship. It was the aviation depot for the eastern side of Korea at that time. And the ensign there that had the captain, I should say, he was thrilled to death because there was 19 of us on his boat, and we were rolling 50-gallon drums off this boat and putting them up on a truck and hauling them 45 miles down to K-18. Well, the first trip down got ambushed, and I didn't have any desire to go down there. But the guy said, you got to go down there. He said, they've got hot water and they've got hot food. And I hadn't shaved in 3 months, so I went down there, and I'd never seen fighters come into a base. The runway at K-18 was made with PSP, which is like erector sets, you know. But when an aircraft would land, it was like a boat taking off. There'd be a rooster tail behind it of mud. But I'd never seen a fighter, so I watched a 4-shipper come in, and they all taxied around and stopped, and I walked over to the one ship because I wanted to see what it really looked like. And when a pilot got out, he said to me, he said, what are you doing here? And I told him, because I was pretty dirty. And he said, where are you from? And I told him, Coronado. He said, well, you look familiar. He said, did you ever work anywhere? And I said, yes, I worked in Perkins Flower Shop. And he was one of the administrators of the Bank of America, and our truck on Orange Avenue was behind this alley. And every day, either myself or my buddy would cut through the bank, go around and get the truck. And he said, you are Hunter, aren't you? And I said, yes, sir. So he said, come with me. He says, we're going to make a Marine out of you. So I was invited to become a plane captain in the Marine Corps at that time. So that was my second tour in Korea. And I went through 3 aircraft carriers, the Barocco, the Sicily, and the Bataan. And I don't know, aircraft carriers are more dangerous than being on land. The problem is with a 4-shipper, when it comes in, if one aircraft's got a hung ordnance, let's say a 500-pound bomb or something, well, he has to go around in circles until the other 3 aircraft land. And then they roll a cargo net about 3/4 of the way down the deck. And when that aircraft comes in and hits that wire, the bomb will come off and skip down the deck. Well, it's armed too. And one never went off while I was there. The EOD team would go pick it up and dump it over the side. However, one came in one day with 2 5-inch rockets. The back bracket had broken, and when the aircraft caught the hook, it was kind of like, you know, when you see an accident, a lot of times it looks like it's in slow motion. The 2 rockets came off, and of course they exploded and killed 14 Marines and blew me over the side of the aircraft carrier. Thank God it had a catwalk on the side, and unlike most aircraft carriers have metal sidewalk around there, this one just had netting, but they found me 18 hours later, and again, my mother got a second letter, telegram I should say, telling me that I was killed in action twice. Well, that was the Korean War, basically. I want to jump forward a little bit, though. I got discharged in November of 1952 at Treasure Island. And of course, you know, when you go through a discharge or when you join the Corps, you've got to fill out all these forms. And I walked down this line, filled all these forms out, and there was a captain there, and he said, I was a staff sergeant then. He said, Sergeant, he says, have you got anything to say? And I said, yes, sir. I said, if I could find that SOB Truman, I'd shoot him. And he said, would you take a chair over here? So I went over and sat down, and needless to say, I got stuck for 4 more weeks in a class taught by 2 female psychologists. And it was one of those things I learned to keep my mouth shut from that moment on. But that was an interesting experience. I got out of the Corps, and I went down and came back home, and I went to San Diego State, and I was flying for the Bank of America as a courier. I'd bought a job for one of my friends, and I met Mr. Patterson one night, who was the president of United Airlines, and he asked me what I was going to do when I graduated, and I said I didn't know, and he said, well, look, he said the 707s are just rolling off the assembly lines. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, good. And he said, we can't get multi-engine jet pilots. He said, if I get in the Air Force and get 300 hours of multi-jet time, he'd guarantee me a job as a co-pilot. Next morning, that night I flew back on a Condor 440, and I went up and sat in a jump seat, and I asked the 2 pilots, I said, how long does it take to get from the flight engineer seat to the co-pilot seat? They said 11 to 15 years. I said, oh my God. Then I asked them how much money they made. The next morning I was in the ROTC office with my right hand up. And of course I graduated in 1956. For the next 20 years I was primarily a fighter pilot, although I graduated from Laredo, Texas in pilot training, went to advanced gunnery school at Williams Air Force Base in F-86Fs, and that was our first supersonic fighter. It was the most beautiful airplane in the world. I still love it. I've flown 34 different flying machines. That's my #1 aircraft. I've flown all of the Century series except the 100 and the 101. The 105 was the end of my career, but that was a monster. In any event, when I graduated from Williams Air Force Base, I was #1 in my class. I was a top gun there, and before the program really got started. But what happened was, General LeMay was then the Chief of Staff. He was also the commander of Strategic Air Command. And one of the problems they had, the B-47, which is that model on the right-hand side over there, is a 6-engine jet bomber. That aircraft still holds the world's international record for the most aircraft lost in flying training accidents. SAC lost 273 of them. And so what somebody on LeMay's staff did, they decided to freeze the graduating classes from the fighter weapons schools. And our whole class was the first class in the back seats of B-47s. Now the B-47 is an interesting airplane. Boeing built it. It really is kind of a good airplane. Boeing built it for 125,000 pounds gross weight. We were sitting on alert at March at 222,000, plus we had 30 rocket bottles under the back of our tail to get us off the ground. Well, the problem was SAC decided they had a few accidents on takeoffs, on Juliet takeoffs, So they decided to move our training weight up to 198,000 pounds. All SAC runways are 13,000 feet long. I can't tell you how many times I've gone down that 13,000-foot runway, watched the 13,000-foot marker go by, and all you can see is the end of the runway. And what you do is you pop the wheel and bounce it in the air and pray a little bit. But I flew that airplane for 6 years. You had to have 2,000 hours as a co-pilot before you could upgrade to an aircraft commander. I upgraded with 400 hours. I had an all-lieutenant crew, so I had a lot of fun. They set the wing down at March Air Force Base, and I went to Little Rock. And the only problem I had down there was, and I told my wife, I said, you know, if you ever see the wing take off in mass, I said, get the kids in the car and get the hell out of here, go north. I had an uncle that lived up in the corner, northwest corner of Arkansas with caves on his place. And I said, if you hear anything about a nuclear detonation, get into one of these caves. I gave her some more information. Well, in any event, we took off, and 6 of us rendezvoused out at a space in, I don't know, New Mexico or someplace, where we had to undo this box with top secret stuff in it. And we wound up at Memphis International Airport. And we all landed there on the runway, turned around, and we sat there for 24 hours with our engines running. We cut them down every 4 hours, refuel, and nobody could get out of the aircraft. The second day, we had 36 hours. We could get out for an hour. One guy could, and we stayed there for 6 days until the Cuban Missile Crisis was over. But that's what it was all about, the 13 days of October. But that was a tough, tough time. SAC in those days, the alert schedule was 1 week on, 1 week off, 1 week on, 1 week off, reflex somewhere in the world to a secret base surrounding Russia for 59 days and come back home. Point was, our average time away from home was 304 days out of the year. So that was a tough time for SAC crews. The divorce rate was probably the highest in the nation at that time. In any event, that was my time in SAC. One of my good friends was, I got 15 more minutes. John, is that right? Okay, good. I'll try to rush through it. One of my friends was a personnel officer, and he called me one day because General LeMay would not allow Air Force assignments to come on SAC bases. And he said there's a secret set of orders on my desk. He said the Air Force wants people that would like to fly World War II fighter prop airplanes. And I said, I'll be up there in 10 minutes. Well, I went up there and filled out the paperwork. It took me about 35 minutes to figure it all out, but I figured with my Marine Corps background and everything, they would accept me. Well, 3 months went by, and I'm on final approach one day in a GCA, and a GCA operator said to me, call the command post and monitor guard, and I did. And they said to report to the wing commander as soon as you land. Well, that's kind of like telling you to go to the principal's office. I queried my co-pilot and my navigator, and they hadn't done anything, so I went up to the colonel's office, and he was brand new. His secretary gave me a cup of coffee, he ushered me in. There was a young major in there, and we spent about 35, 40 minutes talking about fishing, flying, weather, and he finally asked me, he said, would I be willing to fly a World War II propeller fighter in a foreign country where I couldn't wear an Air Force uniform? Well, absolutely, the saying was yes. Then he said, well, if you got shot down, would you be willing to admit that you don't belong to the American military? Yes, sir. Well, we talked some more, and finally they excused me. 3 more months went by, and I figured I didn't make the cut. Then one day, same thing, I'm on final control, GCA, only this time, when I called the command post, they said, Lieutenant, as soon as you land, report immediately. And the word immediately was really tough to the wing commander. So I figured, well, I queried, of course, my crew again. And I thought, well, the captain's list's on base, maybe that's it. So I walked up there, and sure enough, the colonel put my captain's bars on. And he said, Captain Hunter, he says, I've been in the Air Force 26 years, and I've never seen a set of orders like these. They came from the DIA. Well, I'd heard of this CIA and the FBI, but I'd never heard of the DIA. In any event, I was sworn to secrecy, as he was, and I couldn't even tell my wife where I was going the next day, but I had an airline ticket to Wichita, Kansas. And I arrived up there, and my orders said, get a taxi and go down to the train depot. And I went down there, and I had a locker down there. I opened it up with a manila envelope, and I got a train ticket to Blue Eye, Missouri. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever been to Blue Eye, Missouri, but there's only 3 things in that town: a trading post, a gas station, and a Greyhound bus depot. So I went to the Greyhound bus depot with my orders, and sure enough, I opened them up, and I thought to myself, this is really getting funny, because this doesn't happen to professional Air Force officers. This only happens to Steve Canyon and Terry and the Pirates. In any event, I had a train ticket to Fort Walton Beach, Florida, and I'd never heard of that either. But 18 hours later, I got there, and there was a young sergeant there, and he said, "Is that Captain Hunter?" And I said, "Yes." And he says, "Get in my Jeep." And I said, "Where are we going?" He said, "Eglin Air Force Base." I said, "Huh." I said, "I don't know much about Eglin." He said, "Well, it's the largest Air Force installation in the United States." He said, "There are 23 separate runways inside the confines of Eglin." And he said, "You are going to Eglin 23. Okay. Well, I went to Eglin 23. It was a classified thing. I can't talk about that. But then I went down to Eglin 9, Hulbert Field, and I trained there in a modified, that other little airplane there, fighter with a prop on it, for 3 months. And welcome to Vietnam. Vietnam was I don't even know how to describe that. I became, well, first of all, I had to go through a program there, kind of like the Navy SEALs, only it was a little different. The only thing I can say about it is, when I came out of there, we all had black belts in judo. So it was pretty incredible training. I don't want to spend too much time here talking about it, but I do want to bring up one thing that I think is kind of interesting. I couldn't talk about combat without mentioning superstition. Now, fighter pilots will tell you that they are not superstitious. They are the most superstitious people in the world, including myself. I have a superstition about dates, and not the kind that you eat. The date of June 25th has always been my date of infamy in my life. First of all, June 25th, 1950, the Korean War started, and I was invited. June 25th, 1951, I already explained what happened there. I was killed in action on June 25th, 1951. June 25th, 1962, I was on board this aircraft carrier. Again, I was killed in action. 7 years later, I'm now in the Air Force, and my very first mission in a B-47 was with a crew in another squadron, and the aircraft commander went out of his mind, tried to wreck the aircraft, crash it, I should say. Fortunately, I was stronger than him. I made my first landing at Edwards Air Force Base. This is from March Air Force Field. And I don't know where the engines quit. Somewhere on final approach, the engines quit, so I dead stick that baby, but I knew there was 14 miles of runway there, so I figured even an idiot could land it. So anyway, I got that done. That was 7 years after 1952. 2 years later, I was a young aircraft commander in that airplane, and we're headed out over the North Atlantic to Europe, and the tankers didn't show up. And we had to come back to Goose Bay, Labrador. I'm at 36,000 feet, and my engines all quit. So I became a glider pilot. And again, I landed there with snow on the runway. 1 year later, I'm 200 miles off of the coast of Miami down here, coming back from North Africa. The thunderstorms were up to 70,000 feet. The tankers, only one of them showed up. The two ahead of me took most of the fuel. As soon as I backed off the tanker, the first thing that happened was my transmission button went out on my radio. I couldn't transmit, I could receive. And then the radar went out. Now, the thunderstorms are up to 70,000 feet. Inside those thunderstorms, you've got up and down drafts that are 600 to 800 miles an hour. I went from 22,000 feet to 44,000 feet in less than 10 seconds. I was upside down. Everything in that aircraft that had been in there for 10 years was all over the cockpit. I went into an inverted spin. I got the aircraft righted. I over-controlled, I went into a downdraft and into another spin. We recovered at 1,500 feet above the water. And of course, nobody could talk airplane for 5 minutes. I told my navigator, I said, just give me a heading of 270. As soon as we get land, we're bailing out. Well, that was June 25th, 1962. 1 year later, well, I'm returning from a SAC base, actually in Africa again, and I crash landed. My artificial field control went out of the aircraft. Something always broke on B-47s. The average flight out there was somewhere between 20 and 40 write-ups on the airplane. Well, I was coming into Little Rock, and the artificial field, it had like an ice cream freezer in the back end of the airplane, and one of the B-47s crashed over to Kansas a couple of months ago, and every time one of them crashed, security people said, well, we'll deaden this whatever unit this is. And the heater for the artificial field system in the tail caught on fire, so they disabled all the artificial fields. Well, this is what happened to me. It's like, you know, if you lose your power control in an automobile, it's really difficult to twist a wheel, and the brakes are really difficult. It's just the opposite in the airplane. It's hypersensitive. You can't even move the stick, pardon me, or the wheel, without stalling. And I stalled so many times. Well, I flew it for 7 hours like that. When I got to Little Rock, I started down from Memphis, Tennessee, and as I descended, my controls started coming back in. And my crew and I going through all 94 pages of the -1 emergency procedures. We couldn't figure out what was wrong. And finally, when I got down to about 3,000 feet, my controls were in perfectly. Then it dawned on me, I said, I remember this accident in Kansas. Well, I got about 60 feet from the ground, and a piece of ice came down through these pipes and hit the bottom. And suddenly I got hit with 3,400 pounds of hydraulic pressure on my chest, and I was black and blue for 6 weeks. But when I hit the ground, the first thing that happened was engines 4 and 5 broke off the wing and rolled down the runway. When I came down the second time, the main spar right wing broke, and the right wing was hitting the tail back here. So needless to say, we class 26 at B-47. Finally, 1 year later, June 25th, 1964, I got shot down in South Vietnam, and that kind of spoils your whole day. But I don't think General George Armstrong Custer enjoyed June 25th, 1876 either. I know I'm running out of time. Any questions? I'll stop here.
You have 9 lives, Steve.
You'd be surprised.
Tell me about when you met that fellow some years later that you waved goodbye to.
Oh, yes, okay. That lieutenant that I met in Korea, I forgot about this story. When I got stuck in SAC over here at the March Air Force Base, well, first of all of the fighter pilots, we hated SAC. When they went to McConnell, you wouldn't believe what we did over there. We used to light up cigars every morning and blow the smoke at the t-shirts, and nobody wanted to fly. I went to Little Rock, and the first flight I had down there, instructor pilot down there had 2, what they call upgrading co-pilots. You had to have 2,000 hours to upgrade. And the 2 co-pilots were sitting there, and we sat in this room for approximately 3 hours. I finally got up and went over to the IP, and I said, "Excuse me, sir." I said, "What's the mission of the co-pilots?" And he looked at me and he patted me on the shoulder and he said, "Son, the mission for the co-pilots is to listen to SAC talk." You can imagine how I reacted to that. I couldn't believe it. Yes, sir.
You maybe remember the story about B-47 AC that took it under the Mackinac Bridge years ago. Remember that story?
Well, I'll tell you something. I'll be honest with you. I've flown under 2 bridges in my military career. One under the Golden Gate with the B-47, and two with the Narrows Bridge up in Tacoma, Washington. So yeah.
This was turned in by his navigator, and I heard he was court-martialed. Do you remember that story?
Oh yeah, they would do that. I told my co-pilot, my navigator, I'd shoot them if they said anything. So,
He was court-martialed?
you know, you got to understand, you know, fighter pilots are crazy. I mean, you do dumb things, and I know that. And I had a wild career there, so yes, I did some stupid things. Yes, sir, over there. Question?
I was going to say, did you know there's a new book out about the Incheon landing and the battle of the Frozen Reservoir? Terrific book called On oh gosh,
On frozen ground.
no, not frozen ground, on,
Frozen hours?
no, not frozen, they were all frozen, but on desperate ground. On a terrific book about the.
I've heard of it, I haven't read it yet, but I've got about 3 or 4 books on,
It's really excellent, it's a page
yeah.
turner.
well, the temperature up there when we broke out with the Chinese was 50 below zero.
Yeah.
It was pretty darn cold.
Wow.
Anything else?
Did you ever finish that story about the lieutenant?
That's what you were.
Oh, I got off, thank you kindly. Any event, I got I hate to say use this word, every shit detail that was available. And I mean, really, I refused to fly at Little Rock. We were the first team that graduated non-combat ready. And when I got to March Air Force Base, my squadron commander was waiting to kill me. He stood me in a brace. I hadn't been in a brace like that since the Marine Corps, walking around in circles, shouting at me, spitting at me. He was going to give me a bad conduct discharge. Well, he called me in one Monday morning. He says he wanted me to report Friday to the officers club for the women's officers wives club party that night. I was on a decoration detail. So there were 6 of us, and we did our thing, and about 4 o'clock that afternoon, this lieutenant colonel came in. He was the ops officer. I didn't know him at the time. He brought over 4 pictures of beer, set them on a round table, and said, "Come on over, guys, and sit down." He said, "I know everybody on here but this guy." And he pointed right at me. He knew me. And so I thought, oh well. So he asked these guys to introduce themselves, and as this was going on, this idiot lieutenant sitting next to me said, "Colonel, what are those merit badges on your chest for?" Well, protocol-wise, you don't say things like that to an officer, especially a colonel. And everybody was just, oh my God, we just didn't know what to do. And then his stupid lieutenant said, "Colonel, what's their highest merit badge?" Well, if looks could kill, this lieutenant was dead. But the colonel stopped me and said, "Well, guys," he said, "I'll tell you what." He says, "I earned this DFC in Korea, in the Korean War." And he started to tell the story. And he got about, maybe a minute and a half in the story. And I stood up. I said, "Sir, I'd like to propose a toast." And of course, he looked at me. He had already hated me. And I said, "Sir, to the Marines that you left behind, the 3 Marines you left behind." He looked at me, and I looked at him. And I said, "Sir, I'd like to finish your story." And I left nothing out, all the way to the end. He got up around the table, came around and hugged me, and he was crying, I was crying. And he said, "Well, you've got to come to this party tonight. I want you to meet my wife. And I'll see you Monday morning in my office." Well, he turned my whole military career around. So it was a good deal.
Wow.
Anything else? Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah.